writing, automated writing, but it was mostly in the areas that are quite structured, like sport, which is quite easy to write about automatically, and also finance and stock market, which again is very structured. Something goes up 5%, something goes down 5%, and you can kind of automate it quite easily. But now again, we've kind of entered a point that we can go and look at everything, summarize it, and produce. So yeah, the second one is production. Again, could be production of now even images and videos that could be used. And the last category that I would say AI is useful for journalism is publishing and publication in general, where things like audience analytics come into play, which has been into play, recommender systems, and now publishing in different formats for different audiences, because you can have some basic facts and figures there, which we were discussing yesterday actually with David, and then you can kind of produce content in many different forms and many different lengths for different audiences based on what they are interested in. And then you can also use it for kind of semantic linking and semantic annotation to kind of, in the future, you can even make it easier and easier for contextualization and that discovery phase. So that's pretty much how I see AI playing a role these days, at least in journalism and news.
Thanks so much, Perry. Now, David, you're at the coalface of innovation at the BBC. Can you give us some practical examples of how the organisation is thinking about and using AI, including the latest wave of developments in generative AI? And maybe tell us whether or not these changes have been in the public interest or not.
Yeah, I think there's, you can sort of divide up the BBC's engagement with AI into kind of three different levels. At one level in the newsroom, and I'm mostly talking about BBC News here because that's kind of where I've spent my time. In the newsroom, journalists themselves or the editorial teams, just in the process of trying to make their work more efficient, are using specific tools to do specific tasks within their workflows. So things like automated transcription, or even things like using Google Translate to do rough translations for World Service purposes, or to understand what's kind of going on in different ways in the World Service, and a whole host of other things. And these are kind of specific tools to look through large sets of documents, for example, for investigative stories. And so these are just kind of one-off uses of specific AI tools for specific purposes in an existing kind of journalistic workflow. And that's usually just managed by the newsroom themselves. The editors, the journalists kind of decide to do that, and they have a role for it. Then there's this other level, which I've been mostly involved with, which is where News Labs contributes. And it's essentially about new workflows that generally produce familiar things that we produce in news, so articles, video, audio. And these are workflows that typically in the past have used kind of rule-based or very kind of structured techniques, because that was sort of the way that you could do those. And some of the automated journalism techniques have been prominent in that. In 2019, for example, in the general election, we published election results stories for every single constituency in the UK, which was the first time the BBC had ever done that. Previously, we would only publish results stories for about 50 or 60 constituencies that had some kind of special, celebrity or some special situation. But this time we were able to do it for everybody because we use this automation. And that's an example of a completely new workflow, these automated journalism workflows, but producing articles, but customized or personalized for individuals. And I think generative AI has a lot of potential to expand that. And it's important because that sort of being able to give people the stories that are personally relevant to them. If you're in a constituency, you want a results story for your constituency. You don't just want a dashboard of numbers, perhaps. But to be able to adapt stories to different people in different localities. Then there's a third level, which is what BBC R&D, which is our big research and development organization, do. And they do sort of bigger, longer-term things, like tools that break video and audio up into different objects or semantic objects, and then splice those together in different ways for different audiences. They call it object-based media. We've had other projects. We had a very large initiative around voice and AI, and actually News Labs was involved in that as well, where we developed skills for voice agents that let you, manipulate the bulletin, the news bulletin a little bit. So you could skip ahead, or you could ask for more detail. And that was successful. It's the default news bulletin on Alexa in the UK, for example, but very, very hard to produce because, again, it used these kind of very structured rules-based. Editors had to, produce the news in all these little structured ways and then fit that into the model for the tool to use every day. And that's where generative AI can maybe improve that. So yeah, I think there's just this whole level from right at the day-to-day editorial activities of the newsroom all the way up to these sort of maybe 5-year horizon, kind of completely reimagining what news could be. All of those are, in terms of like how the BBC is actually going to roll this out, I think caution is going to be very high on the agenda. We do a lot of prototypes, we do a lot of tests, but the BBC's most important kind of value proposition for the UK is the trust that the people have, and not just the UK, but worldwide. The BBC is the most trusted news brand in the US, for example. And so being cautious about the, maintaining that trust in the brand, I think is going to cause us to go a little slower. It's not because we don't have the tools. We have all of this stuff kind of, tested and all the rest of it. It's because we're going to have to figure out how to do it sensibly and responsibly and not damage that trust value.
Thanks so much, David. So many different points there I can't wait to touch upon, actually. Atusa, you've been thinking about the social and ethical questions these kind of conversational agents raise, which can be fundamental challenges for knowledge production arenas like journalism, like supercharging myths and disinformation, right? Can you talk through maybe some of the harms here? Because we've had a lot of positives, but some of the harms, and maybe outline for us who really benefits from this, from your perspective, Atusa.
Yeah, thanks. So I think we heard about some of the potential benefits that these technologies can have in terms of the production of news and the kind of fast speed we can observe in producing new content, discovering new content, etc. But on the other hand, when we think about responsible journalism, we would always think, okay, there are some special journalists that throughout their careers build some kind of profile, and we trust them. And so we follow them, we listen to their news, and we kind of trust what they say. So they give us a kind of a worldview, they kind of manufacture for us a kind of a journalistic kind of worldview. So one of my very favorite journalists is Christiane Amanpour, for example, from CNN. I follow her for many years, and I love what she does because she has kind of passed the test of time in terms of the responsible work she's done in producing content. But with these kinds of technologies, we are going to see the production of loads of new material that sound like coherent text and sound like things that maybe a mediocre artist could write. Unfortunately, we don't have good tests to distinguish whether the content that is generated is really factual. And the reason for that is that in many areas or many domains of discourse or conversation, it's just hard to define fact. So in science, maybe we can kind of agree that this is a fact, or maybe a big community of people can agree that climate change is a fact, right? Some people deny that, but we have good reasons, we have good evidence to kind of put those factual information in the center and react on that and reflect on that and build policies around it. But in many domains that actually are changing the world, changing the power dynamics in the world, such as historical events, political events, many times we don't have access to that kind of factual information, right? So, for example, imagine now there are things happening there's a war between Russia and Ukraine. There are some journalists on the ground and they report information. There are lots of amazing Ukrainian citizens that report information, but it's just we don't have direct access to some of the evidence. And so imagine there could be some malicious users that want to kind of like create a big conspiracy theory. They have like really malicious intent in the background. They can use these technologies to produce information like very rapidly, very cheap costs, right? And even they can produce their own source of website, right? They can kind of like introduce a new kind of media website, right? Even GPT-4 can help you to kind of like design a website, so you don't even need to be a website developer. So you can imagine that possibly there could be some malicious actors, and I don't want to be pessimist. I think that's a fact of our world, that there are malicious actors out there, and so they can kind of like benefit from these systems and can kind of produce loads of information that are kind of difficult to distinguish whether they are factual or not, and they can attract some people who have sort of sentiments for those kinds of information. And so I think in like short to medium term, we are going to see like an explosion of these sorts of information that is going to confuse many of us about what is fact and what is fiction. And so it's very, I think, very, very important for the responsible journalist community to kind of think very deeply and seriously about these issues and think about how we are going to challenge, how we are going to address these kinds of challenges. Obviously, I don't think it's a question that just journalists need to answer, so these kinds of like panel discussions with between journalists and those who are developing this kind of like systems just very, very important. But I think the issue now, or the kind of revolution that we are seeing with this generative AI systems, is not that they're just kind of like helping everyone to produce things and they're being democratized, and this democratization is necessarily good. On the other hand, they provide lots of access to malicious users in the world, and those accesses and apps and news that they can produce can really confuse us as humans to distinguish between fact and fiction. And I think if we reach that point, we will all face a kind of like a huge existential crisis generated by this kind of technologies, where we are not able to see what should we trust, what we shouldn't trust. And I think these are like really, really important questions that needs to be, we don't have answer to them, but needs to be kind of discussed, and we need to all decide how do we want to go forward with this potentially very interesting AI system.
Thanks so much, Tusa. So much food for thought there. You finished there about fact versus fiction, and I think when I read about this panel, I mean, the first question from my perspective is, how can we ensure that we're actually providing accurate reporting? How can we actually, when we use AI, ensure that accuracy is first and foremost? Harry, what do you think about that?
I think it is hard to ensure that accuracy is first and foremost, but if we go back around 10 years and when, or maybe even less, 6-7 years, and when social media was becoming popular, and we were really worried about truth, and then a lot of initiatives were basically built around fake news, misinformation, and disinformation, and they were very, very important because we needed to know, we needed to be able to tell fact from fiction, or lie from not lie. But again, as Tusa says, it's quite hard to tell what is fact and which point of view you look at. So I think we are gonna, the important challenge ahead of us is really verification of information that's going to be put out there, because so much is going to be put out there. So we need some other level of, we've been talking about data literacy and information literacy for many years now, but I think we are entering a new era of literacy, information literacy, AI literacy, where we need to learn how to deal with this amount of automated, generated content. We need to increase our critical awareness and critical thinking to be able to kind of criticize whatever we see even more than before. So I feel like social media gave us a little bit of a taste of what it could be in terms of fake content. We're just getting to a point that so much of it is now generated automatically.
David, how are you tackling this at the BBC? I mean, I imagine you'll want to make sure that there's enough robust systems in place, that there's a lot of checks that go on. And talking about truth, I mean, that is, you've got quite a challenge on your hands, haven't you?
Well, I think, there's this sort of, deep epistemological, thing about truth. Was this historical event, to be interpreted in this way or to be interpreted in that way? But that's a probably a relatively small portion of journalism. And I think, the bulk of journalism, trust the BBC impartiality, some track record of accuracy, transparency in the processes become more important than kind of making value judgments about, whether January 6th was an insurrection or, some kind of friendly tourist thing or whatever the other side is. And I think that transparency one is really important. At the BBC, we have a set of guidelines around use of machine learning. And one of those guidelines is that, when we're using these tools, we label and we communicate that we are using these tools. That's also in the Partnership on AI's new guidelines for synthetic media. I think it's also in the EU's AI Act. To just, when a piece of content is out there that is AI generated, just label it. It's AI generated. And most of the news organizations, with the exception of Reach for some reason, that are using AI are doing that. They're labeling the text. So that's one piece of information. I think responsibility and identifying, who is responsible, like a person who is responsible for the output, whatever the tools are to create that output, whether it's an organization or a byline or whatever, is also part of it. And because, at least in a large news organization like the BBC, what that does is enforce or incent, the careful editing, or what we call human in the loop in the BBC guidelines. And then through that editing, taking responsibility for the accuracy of the piece. And so these situations, which you're starting to see with some of these aggregators that are popping up using the GPT tools, it's kind of amorphous as to who's responsible for what. It's like just this kind of big blob, whereas being very specific that this person or this organization is responsible for this piece, I think is part of it too.
Yeah, I think that, what's a step in the right direction is to label content and watermark it and put on the right description that it was generated by AI is certainly a good thing, but is it a bit of a cop-out? And what I mean by that is, are people who consume material with that watermark or that description that says it's written by an AI supposed to have an extra level of skepticism? And that brings me on to another point, which is, but does the general audience consuming that media have that intellect and that critical analysis thinking there? What do you think about that, Atusa?
Yeah, I think I have to say this watermarking strategies are not yet perfect or even close to perfect. And I'm not sure, I think just because I was like watching an interview with Jeff Hinton, I actually did his PhD at the University of Edinburgh where I'm working, and he's a grandfather or father of deep learning. And there's been a very interesting interview with him a couple days ago, and he just was very skeptical about whether we would be ever able to make very reliable technologies that can kind of like label this kind of piece of writing is AI generated or not. So having that in mind, I think one other kind of like challenge is that many of these systems are now, at least like say GPT-4, GPT 3.5, ChatGPT, they're really good in English language. And so many people are using the systems for other languages as well. And so in many other kind of countries, we are still not, or those countries are not still catching up with AI literacy that we are having, for example, in the UK or the US or other like European or North American countries. And so I think there is this like implicit implication of the use of these technologies for some of the other countries where you don't have watermarking technologies that can kind of distinguish between fact or fiction, let's say in Farsi or maybe in Arabic, things like that. So there's this like ramification of the use of these technologies going in the production of news in many other languages. And I think that's kind of like a very interesting kind of phenomena that we need to pay more attention to as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, when we talk about language tools and translation tools like that, I mean, we, for years at the BBC, Click has been translated into something like 28 languages or something for the different BBC news services, world services. And personally, working very closely with the BBC Farsi and the Persian version of Click, even sometimes we as humans really struggle, and even the language experts struggle to translate content from English into their respective languages. And so basically, is there a bit of a danger here that using an AI, that people could be receiving kind of second-rate journalism, and who's kind of verifying and validating that the AI-generated content in a foreign language is actually the best representation of the facts and the style? Barry, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it is going to take quite some time for all languages to be as AI ready as English is. And I think that's actually a big problem, because that is going to create a divide in the world in terms of a lot of developments, because a lot of developments are now, I think in the next number of years, are going to be built on top of these language models. And we are going to see a huge divide between English-speaking countries, or countries where English is commonly used, such as the Netherlands or the Scandinavian countries, and the countries where English is not as commonly used, or obviously the day-to-day language is another one. So I think we might have some level of translation, like Atosa mentioned Farsi, you mentioned BBC Persian. I know that the translation is not great, it's kind of mediocre. You can get some level of some idea maybe, but human in the loop is very important. So we will maybe get there, I don't know. I think the existence of this language models, large amounts of text, is going to help with that, for the dictionaries to be refined using a large amount of Persian text, for example, because we can run machine learning on that. But still, what I'm worried about is that divide between English-speaking countries and the rest.
Talking about kind of, I guess, the human aspect of translation, it strikes me that obviously when we talk about AI in journalism, as a journalist myself, I kind of go, what about me? What about my job? And what am I doing here? And I kind of do have slight concerns. I'm making statements now, not asking questions. I do have slight concerns that that as AI gets rolled out, there'll be less of me that's required. And I mean, what impact do you think the AI is going to have on the workforce? And I think there's, like David, it'd be great to know what you think about this, because obviously within the BBC we've got loads of rules and guidelines and are very focused on like ensuring that, our employees are, well kept. So how is AI going to change work in journalism?
I turn the question back on you. How do you plan to use AI in Click, for example? We're very, very early on this path into this sort of synthetic media world, but already the explosion of creativity that people are displaying in text, in images, starting to be in video, is breathtaking. And essentially, we've got this whole new category of tools and ways to be expressive and creative. And those category of tools are open to everybody. You don't have to be, super skilled or have a big arts education or whatever it is. You can just sort of sit down and play with them. We've kind of seen this to a certain degree with TikTok and how people have been creative with TikTok. I think journalism will change. The ways that you can express and tell stories in journalism will change, but it'll use these tools in the same way that journalism has used, every tool that's come along. Radio was a tool, a new weird thing at some point. Television was, color television was, the web was. I think. A lot of journalism that doesn't need to be done, the routine formulaic stuff that doesn't need to be done by people won't be done by people. And there'll be still lots and lots of stories to tell in lots and lots of new and different ways.
But radios, traditionally, they weren't the ones telling the story. They'd still need humans to actually do the talking on them. And that's where I think we're facing something that's quite interesting here, novel. Even a few weeks ago myself, we were talking about reporting on the Spotify story. I don't know if anyone saw about their AI DJ, where they have a virtual digital disc jockey that provides filler in between the tracks. It's like, will that now just replace us in the future? What do you think, Atosa, from your research?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question. And when I mentioned existential crisis before, I really didn't want to just talk about something like philosophically abstract, I really meant it. So you mentioned journalism. I wanted to say software engineers, natural language processing researchers that are developing these technologies, they exactly say the same things that you're saying, that they feel like, oh, these technologies are going to do a lot. So you can do loads of amazing coding with like GPT-4. And basically that kind of like unleashes loads of creativities or opportunities, as David was mentioning. But on the other hand, it also raises this very important question for us, that what are we going to do? If you want to give an optimistic answer, like a very simplified, like shallow optimistic answer, we can say, well, look, previously there were other kind of technologies that came out, and then we kind of adapted to them. And so basically, like, we're going to also adapt to this. But I think the generative AI is doing something radically different, because it is changing our cognitive capacities, the very things that made us human, like the kind of things that we needed to, you know, always with cars or with airplanes or all the previous technologies, we still needed to learn, we still needed to think, we still needed to produce things out of our minds. But now there are these new plugins, like you can just plug in GPT-4 into a website, which is what OpenAI is now offering, and then this GPT-4 is going to read an article for you, 150 pages article for you, and in a couple of seconds is going to output a summary of these results, right? And so what does it mean for students to learn and summarize and reflect on kind of text when we have these things? But I think, so this is a very good that's a very good question. And very recently, I think a week or two ago, OpenAI like released a very interesting report doing a very careful study of the impact of GPT-style kind of technologies on the US labor market. And I think we should exactly do a very similar thing for the UK labor market as well, just to get a realistic image, like a more empirically kind of grounded image of what is really happening. And then I think then different sectors can kind of like think more concretely about these issues. If they think there's a big danger of these technologies, maybe they can kind of push and then say, no, we don't want these technologies to kind of come into our work, or they need to find about policies or ways to kind of adapt. And as David was suggesting, finding good ways to incorporate these technologies into what we are doing, so they can, we are doing a collaboration with them rather than they replacing us.
Sure. Let's talk about some of those opportunities a little bit here. And obviously, you know, as a journalist and a filmmaker, you know, I do utilize AI in the production of the stories. So, for instance, I use record a feature on my Google phone. It tells me, helps me transcribe interviews and stuff like that to save some time. I'd also definitely use it when it came to like maybe, well, I say definitely. I would like to be able to use it to verify pieces of information or find out stats and facts, but I'm a little bit worried that it may be totally made up. As seen in the last few weeks, that has happened a lot. But anyway, let's talk about some of like the tools that I guess journalists can use. And this is from the audience actually, where they put forward a question saying, how can we as AI people, data scientists, really help journalists and offer them a helping hand and bring the change? That's what they also said. What do you think about that, Bahar? You know,
how can AI people and like data scientists help?
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work. So I think how different disciplines can help one another, including journalists helping AI developers and AI developers helping journalists, is to try to talk to one another as much as we can, because AI developers could develop something that is not super useful, maybe for the journalists, but at the same time, journalists could really, there are worries here and also there are needs here that you are already saying, I like to do this and I like to do that. So if we kind of start talking to each other, I think, to me, maybe it's a simplified answer, but I really think we can make a change. I don't know, maybe David has a better insight into that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, I think there's a fairly fundamental assumption that a lot of people have been making over the last year since the GPT models have become so popular, which is that this transformers architecture, this deep neural network architecture and the way it works is the only kind, or the only way to do AI. But there are other ways to do AI, and some of those ways are more capable of handling causal connections and be more explicit about the connections, say, between events or between things. And I think in a lot of ways, that's a more compatible form of AI with journalism than the large language models. The large language models are, they're almost like the salesman of AI. They want to sound really good, but they don't have, just by their nature, this sort of worldview or this sort of causal model underneath, whereas there are other forms of AI that can. So I think there are a lot of possibilities for journalism beyond the Transformers way of doing AI, which has been so popular in the last year.
Yeah, and when it comes to like journalists kind of embracing it, do you think that like it's only a matter of time before we all do? I mean, do you think that, how long do you think it'll be before everyone, or maybe we already do? We already do in a way.
Well, I just throw out something controversial here. If you're a journalist and you're in a newsroom, in a big news organization, and you're on a deadline, and you've got to get stuff out the door, and ChatGPT is just sitting right there. It's a tool, right? And so my hypothesis, I got no evidence for this, but my hypothesis is that in newsrooms all over the place, all kinds of journalists are already using it in all kinds of ways. That would just make sense. Yeah,
so it kind of brings me on to another question I've got for you guys, which is about, say that's the case and it becomes a bit of an arms race to who can employ the best AI for their news organizations. What does that say about the future of journalism? I mean, what does that say about competition and monopolization of different media agencies and outlets if they've got enough funding, capital behind them to utilize the latest version of Chat 20 or whatever from years around? Right now we're seeing it, with people that have the cash can have the tools. What does that say about the future of journalism? And I guess, how we will consume news as well from certain sources that always get the scoops and the breaking news over others.
I think that's a really good question, because again, that monopolization, because a lot of these technologies are in a sense coming from one source, and we're kind of back to that question of divide. Is this divide going to get bigger and bigger, or is it going to give opportunities to smaller news organizations to do more creative work that they were not able to do before?
I think GPT-20 is never going to have relationships with people in Westminster. It's never going to. It's never going to have in its training data, what happened, 15 minutes ago, and the synthesis to put that together in ways that humans can relate to. I think there's a lot of formulaic journalism that should be automated, but there's an awful lot of journalism, investigative journalism, fast-breaking, complex stories, personality-related stories that I don't think these systems are going to touch for a very long time.
What do you think about that, Atusa? Do you think we're years and years away from that eventuality, or?
Yeah, I think if I may, I think the very journalistic agencies, that very concept is going to also change, right? So I think it could be that like BBC is producing all different kinds of news in many different sections, and some of those sections that require this very careful local understanding of events or require having investigative journalists, those bits will remain, but maybe some parts of BBC where it's producing like more everyday news wouldn't be as exciting. So the very institution of BBC, I think, and many other similar kind of agencies would be revolutionized or changed in some sense by these technologies as well. But I totally agree with David, because we have this kind of like human judgment capacities that require very context sensitive, like local understanding of events, requires lots of implicit knowledge and etc. And I don't think these technologies will ever be able to do that, because they are great. Like they produce average information, right? So they can do crazy things about average information, extracting information, search, but they won't have this like very unique capacities of some of the journalists that produce really unique content. Yeah.
I guess I just maybe put a question to you maybe on that. Pretty much all news organizations use newswire services, which in a sense brings them exactly the same piece of news. So maybe we can look at it from that point of view. How is it that the journalism from different news organizations, or even basic news reporting, is not completely identical to each other, given that they're all using the feed from AP or Reuters or PA. And maybe we can use the same ideas behind that. How are they personalized? Then we can kind of apply it to the content that we get from generative AI to not be exactly the same. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think there's lots of examples of ways in which similar similar processes or mechanisms have worked in journalism before. But even kind of stepping back a little bit, it's actually the sort of the key stakeholder here is actually not the journalists; it's the audiences who consume news. And we have a crisis with news. We have a lot of crises with news. One of them is that more and more of the population is basically not engaging with serious news. News avoidance is a huge, big thing. There are huge portions of the population that are basically shut out of, this sort of standard, 600 or 800 word article, fairly educated language that assumes a lot of prior knowledge. This sort of set of assumptions, and the opportunities to make not just sort of the more formulaic kinds of news, but to reversion investigative news, breaking news and so on, into ways that are more valuable and accessible to more people on their own terms. There's huge opportunities there to bring more people into the news, the news environment.
Sure. I mean, let's talk about consuming for a little bit there, and the consumers, because if you're looking at the audience who is actually reading the news material that's put out, and you think about how AI will assist in that delivery to them, obviously there are great advantages there, right? That people can get this personalized content and that they can maybe discover new information that they may thought they were potentially not that interested in, but now they really are. But is there a bit of a danger here and a risk that when you hyper-personalize someone's news feed, that might narrow their mindset and view on the world? And I guess this is a question that's kind of the recent revolution in AI. But I see this as potentially having a doubling down effect where people, when they consume news now, with the help of AI, could potentially end up in a bit of an echo chamber that just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. What do you think about that? Is that an issue that you've noticed in your research, Bahari? Or?
Again, I think I go back to the same questions we had when we started using social media, because we did have the echo chambers for our social media feeds. But to me, I'm going to let Atusa answer the philosophical side of it. But I think to me, these technologies are not going anywhere, so we can't avoid them. So we just need to find ways to incorporate it into our work and daily life. And that is, I think, that is the question that we need to look into. But I think Atusa will have a better answer.
Yeah, I think I kind of slightly disagree, because I don't think we can avoid. And I think that the production of misinformation and disinformation, as we already mentioned, is gonna go up at scale. It's gonna be cheap. It's gonna be democratized. Everyone can now produce this kind of information. So I think that's actually one of the big challenges. But I think there's one other challenge that will come, I guess, in the next few years, is that so far we are all using this GPT style technologies. They're not personalized. They can do so many different things, right? But now what many of the companies are going to do is that I think they're going to get these technologies, they're going to personalize them. And maybe in a couple of years, all of us will leave it like personal assistants, right? And these personal assistants can exactly deliver the kind of news that you want about the subjects that you want, so you would be more productive and more efficient. And then there's this more interesting question of what are the source of those kind of personal information that you receive and maybe I don't receive. So I think this echo chamber kind of idea is going to actually propagate into new forms by this technology.
We'll all be like wealthy celebrities surrounded by our staff and cut off from the real world.
Yeah.
But there is a bit of the tides are changing, aren't they, David? Because I hear that actually a lot of consumers or the audience don't necessarily want something that's hyper-personalized. They want a shared experience. They want to be able to talk to their mate down the pub who works in a completely different industry, their grandma, their grandson, whatever, about stories. They don't want necessarily totally personalized.
Yeah, but I think there's a couple of different kinds of personalization here. So the one I think that that mostly pertains to is recommendations, which has been an issue like for the last decade or so. And even in recommendations and the echo chambers and filter bubbles are slightly different, but with filter bubbles, the evidence, the academic evidence, is that that is not as big a problem as people thought it was. That filter bubbles, kind of, they're mostly about, ironically, people consuming traditional media, watching one television station, Fox News or something, or reading one newspaper, and that people who are mostly digital, they get a much more varied diet in their information. That's the way the academic evidence is going. But there's this second kind of personalization, which is just opening up now with generative AI, which is, it's not about the story that's selected for you, it's about the way that you experience that story. So it's about consuming a story as an image gallery or a cartoon or something like that versus as a 600-word wall of text. So there's still issues around who are you going to recommend what are you going to recommend to whom. That's still there. But this is more about, well, if you're going to recommend a story, how do you communicate that story in a way that's accessible to that person?
Sure. We're actually pretty much out of time now, but I feel like I keep asking you all more and more questions, especially around tailoring news content to specific regions and stuff like that, which is a huge issue in geolocations and accessing key markets and audiences. But I just wondered if you had, and Bronwyn wanted to ask as well from you, one key takeaway that you can give to our audiences here, and maybe it's something that they really need to learn about or something you see as a priority going forward. Atisa?
Yeah, I'd say enjoy the hype and enjoy all the cool experiences you can have with these technologies, but keep the critical mind open and think about how this technology potentially can impact whatever sector you're coming from or whatever you're interested in doing with. I think this critical kind of reflection on issues, unfortunately, is not at all discussed. All of the CEOs of the companies that release these technologies and steal our hearts and minds with these technologies only mention that, oh, there is a problem, and maybe these technologies are going to produce some kind of existential risk. And by all of them, I mean the CEO of OpenAI, the CEO of Google, Microsoft, all of these companies, right? And I think that's not enough. So we need, I think, as public, as citizens, responsible citizens, we all need to kind of feed into this, the social awareness of the potential impacts of these technologies that we might not like. And I think all of us would be able to feed into this technology the same way that all of us are excited by this technology. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity.
David?
Yeah, it's somewhat similar. I mean, I think that we are not sophisticated, as societies, we're not sophisticated enough in how we're thinking about the risks. There's this sort of view of the risks, the existential risk of AI, and it's like a Terminator, Skynet kind of a thing. And that is not what Transformers are going to do. There's always going to be a kill switch there. We can turn it off whenever, wherever we want. It's not that kind of a risk. The risks that we are facing are much more subtle, maybe a little more boring, but really, really serious nonetheless. I'll give you an example. There's a podcast I listen to that I can recommend from the New York Times called Hard Fork. And I was listening to the last episode on the train on the way up here. And one of the podcasters there, he was describing this. He was very positive about large language models and what they could do. And he was describing this scenario where, well, I could have if Google with Bard, if they connected it up to all of the information that Google have about myself or about my friends, then if it was my friend's birthday, the Bard could just generate this this very specific, meaningful, heartfelt birthday message. They could put this together with photographs and knowing the history, knowing our email communications between each other. They could put together this very emotional, heartfelt thing, and they could send that off to the friend. And he was thinking about this as this positive thing. I could just push the button and it could do this. And I'm sitting there thinking, but what if you're the friend, right? And you get this heartfelt, tear-jerking, full of pathos kind of message from your friend on your birthday. And it was pushed by, pushing a button on a machine, right? And you do that at scale across a society, and what does it do to our relationships to each other? What does it do to our self-identities? These are the kind of questions. They're not the big killer robot coming to get everybody. It's like, why do we get up in the morning,
Sure, very quickly, Barry, one sentence.
Yeah, I think I can just echo what Atisa and David said. It's enjoy the ride, be critical. They're not going to go away, so try to use them in a responsible manner, but also, don't be too afraid.
Great. Thanks so much for our excellent panelists. Really interesting, really interesting. Thanks so much.